thank you. We're playing two truths and a lie here, so you can decide which was which. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. Hope you're having a good conference so far. This talk is accessibility that scales. As mentioned, my name is Tyler Hawkins. I'm a senior software engineer at Webflow. I work on our design system team with a very heavy emphasis and focus on accessibility. So, brief introductions really quick. Why am I here? I care deeply about accessibility. I think it is the morally right thing to do to make our apps accessible. I think the internet is for everyone, but it will only be so if we make it that way. So I'm always here to advocate for good accessibility practices. I've been doing software engineering for about 10 years. Half of that, the last 5 years, have been very heavily accessibility focused. At Workfront, it was recently acquired by Adobe back in 2021, I think. But at Adobe Workfront, I led our accessibility team for a little while. It's a lot of fun. And right now, I work on our design system team, very much leading our accessibility efforts within the company there. More importantly, why are you here? The talk is about accessibility, so my default assumption right now is that you care about accessibility. Maybe you are interested in learning about it for the first time, or maybe you are very much involved in leading the accessibility efforts at your company or helping advocate for it. My other assumption that I'm going to make is that perhaps you've experienced that accessibility can be hard. Oftentimes, when people are talking about accessibility or venting or complaining about the struggles that they've had, is that it's not so much a technical problem that they've experienced. Yes, there are things that are technically challenging in accessibility, but more so the problems have usually been organizational. Trying to get accessibility efforts off the ground at your company. And so, common frustrations or areas of concern or confusion, maybe you don't know where to start. Maybe you're just learning about accessibility, or you've been advocating for a long time, but you have this massive legacy app that is very inaccessible, and you have no idea where to start. Where do we start actually fixing things? What part of our process can we improve upon? Maybe you're having trouble getting buy-in or gaining momentum with your accessibility efforts. Another very common struggle is that people have expressed, I'm on board, I know that accessibility is important, I think it's the right thing to do, but how do I convince other people? How do I convince my manager or VP of engineering or a CTO or even just other engineers or developers or designers that this is also important as well? How do we start kickstarting that? Maybe you've made some good progress. Maybe you've started with some accessibility initiatives, but you're finding that it's very difficult to keep up. You've accomplished some wins in some areas of the app. Some places are looking a little better. But you continue to release new content, and new things that are being built continue to be inaccessible, which becomes extremely frustrating of why do we keep repeating these same mistakes over and over and over. It's very easy to get burnt out in the accessibility world. Got a little ahead of myself, but yes, maybe you're suffering from burnout or frustration. Maybe you've been doing this for a while, for a few years, and you're making some progress, but just really feeling like maybe your organization or people are just not getting it, and you can't figure out how to gain traction there. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Our goals for the talk: I want to help you succeed in your accessibility efforts. I'm going to share some real life experiences, both good and bad, of things that have gone well at various companies I've been at and leading the accessibility efforts there. Again, the theme for this conference is managing complexity, and so we're going to talk about that, talk about how we manage not so much the technical complexity here, but the organizational and people complexity that comes with the job. Brief disclaimer, your mileage may vary. These are all things that worked or did not work for me. What worked for me, though, may not work for you. It's very important, I think, when we have any sort of discussions, not just about accessibility, but really anything in engineering, is to be able to separate the principles from the practices. We often have these ideas that we get from our past experiences that this is the way that things should be done and this is the gospel truth. But it's often not. We all have very different backgrounds, very different past experiences, different contexts. We look at different companies, different industries, different company sizes, different company needs. Our own experiences are different. The people around us are different. So yeah, take what's useful, discard the rest, try to find those principles. So with that, we are going to talk about 12 tips to help your accessibility efforts scale. So number one, You can't just demand that all content moving forward must be accessible and then expect it to be so. This happens all the time, everywhere. That maybe you go to a conference, you come to this today, and you say, yes, let's make things accessible, let's do this. And so you start talking to your coworkers, and you say, we need to make things accessible. From now on, we're going to build accessible content. And if you're really lucky, you'll have your manager or your VP of engineering, your CTO get on board, and they will also say, yes, this is our mandate. From now on, all content we build is going to be accessible. We're going to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AA standards. That is the mandate from now on. This happened at a company that I worked at. We made a very public customer-facing statement saying from now on, all features we build will meet WCAG 2.1 AA. That was released, that statement was made 4 or 5 years ago. A year went by, we continued to release inaccessible content. Another year went by, we made another public statement saying we're gonna do this, it's gonna be better. Another year went by, we continued to release inaccessible content, which is extremely frustrating, right? We've made this public commitment, and yet we refuse to follow through for some reason or another. And so it's very important to recognize this reality, is that simply mandating it, whether it comes from you or someone higher up, doesn't solve the problem. There's a reason that you're releasing inaccessible features or inaccessible content, and it's important to first identify the root causes of why that's happening. So, following up on that, tip 2, be pragmatic in your approach. Start where you are. The reason why those mandates, again, don't work just on their own is that there are underlying processes in place that are contributing to the fact that things are inaccessible, right? So you need to know the current state of your organization. Are there technical reasons why it's difficult or impossible to release accessible features? Are there organizational or process reasons? Do people feel rushed? Is accessibility not baked into the design process? And so then people are later playing catch up, and then it's time to release a feature and you do an audit and you realize that, okay, hey, we've got accessibility issues. And then the product manager says, never mind, we're gonna release this anyway. We have to get this out to customers, right? Maybe there are process issues, organizational issues, but we need to understand what those are, right? So be pragmatic in your approach, start where you are. You can't just say that we're gonna start doing this and then have no actual changes to your process or technical tech stack or implementations to actually facilitate that goal. All right, so number 3, start with the design system. Let's say you're on board, you've got support in your company, we are going to start making things accessible. Where do you actually start? Where do you start fixing content or focusing on? I'm very biased because I work on our design system team. I've done design systems at my last several companies. But the design system is the fundamental building block of your company. Some of you in here, you might have your own in-house design systems that you build. Others might have maybe a third-party system that you use. You don't have your own team, but you do rely on some sort of building blocks. The design system, and sorry, I should start with definitions. If you're not familiar with what a design system is, this is a major oversimplification, but it essentially boils down to the most visible artifact is a component library, right? You have little building blocks that you can use to assemble your application. Now, if the design system that you're working with isn't accessible, it's going to be difficult or perhaps nearly impossible to build accessible features, right? If you're an engineer and you're building a feature that involves a modal dialog or a select or menu or tooltips or whatever, and those things out of the box are not accessible, then your whole feature is not going to be accessible, right? If the modal dialog doesn't manage focus properly, you're going to have keyboard accessibility issues, people not being able to get in or out of the dialog or losing focus. Same for screen reader difficulties. If your select or menu components don't work with the keyboard and they're just mouse only to click things, right? Now you've eliminated the ability to use your keyboard in your app. If your underlying color palette or brand style guide doesn't have good color contrast or good color combinations that you use, well, if you're building things that are on brand, you're going to have color contrast issues throughout your entire app, right? And so we have to start at the foundation. We have to start with the design system. Now on the flip side, those are all the challenges of an inaccessible design system. Now look at an accessible design system, right? You've got all these color contrast issues in your app, but you fixed the color contrast issues in the design system. Now you've resolved like 400 accessibility issues throughout your app, right? It also makes it very, very easy to remediate issues within the app if you start focusing at the design system level, right? If you have 100 modal dialogues in your app that you use, and now you've fixed it at the design system level, now you've fixed 100 instances of inaccessible dialogues, right? So start the design system. Again, this goes for both cases of if you are building your own in-house design system, great, focus on that, start fixing things up there. If you're using a third-party design system, please evaluate that. You may not be actually fixing those. You could submit issues to them in GitHub. But if you're choosing a design system or evaluating a design system, make sure you see how accessible it is before you start using it. All right, number 4, make the right choice the easy choice. If anyone is familiar with behavioral economics or choice architecture, the whole theory of that is that the way people that make choices is we mute that? We're good. Hit the mute. The way that people make choices is heavily influenced by the way that they are presented. Just a couple non-technical examples. People who are trying to get people to be organ donors within your country, right? I believe in the US you have to opt in to be an organ donor, right? You have to check the box to say I want to be an organ donor. In many other countries, it's checked by default. You have to opt out to be an organ donor. And guess what? In those countries where it's the default to be an organ donor, they have much higher contribution rates. You might notice a similar principle with maybe like your 401k within your company. In some companies, they don't like auto-enroll you and you're just at 0% contribution. In other companies, if you do nothing, you're auto-enrolled at like a 6% contribution. So yay, you're saving for retirement. They've made the default choice the easy choice, right? Now, tying that into software engineering, as people and as software engineers, we often try to follow the path of least resistance. These product teams or feature teams that are building your product and your app are trying to accomplish some goal. They're trying to get their feature out the door. They're trying to meet some user need. And so if your design system does not meet their needs or they can't accomplish what they're trying to do, then they're not going to use the design system, right? They'll either hack on top of it or they'll find some sort of alternative approach, right, to solve it, which may not be the most accessible way possible. However, if you have a design system in place and you have an accessible design system in place, and that design system actually has the components or meets the different use cases that feature teams need, people will be able to use it. That's one of our big goals on our design system team on Webflow is to make it very enjoyable and easy to use our design system where there's not friction there and it's just the easy, obvious default choice is, yeah, build the design system and great, it's accessible, which means now you've got some accessibility baked into your feature. All right, tip number 5, listen to your customers and use data to determine where to focus your efforts. So we're going through a process here. We have focused on our design system. We have a lot of our core pieces working well. They're nice and accessible. But what about kind of the bigger picture? Where should you look? Maybe you have a lot of things that either are partly using your design system or they're not using your design system at all. But you can start to think about things in terms of user workflows or perhaps maybe various pages that users tend to visit more often than others. For example, perhaps you're an e-commerce company. You probably want to focus on like the checkout page, right? You want people to actually be able to purchase your products, right? Hopefully you've got data in place monitoring, maybe just at the very least like page traffic amounts to see what your most highly used pages are. But that probably shows up as a very important page. If you're not an e-commerce company, maybe you're just some other web application, surely you have data in place to show that, hey, these are our top 10 used pages or features or workflows based on your user data. This is what we did at Adobe Workfront. We used Datadog to find our top 10 most visited pages, and then during a large accessibility remediation project, we knocked out those top 10 pages and made them accessible. And those top 10 pages, they accounted for 67% of all of our page traffic, right? We had like, 200 or 300 pages within the app, but those top 10 accounted for most of it, right? It's the 80-20 rule at work, the Pareto principle. At Webflow, some things that we've done just listening to our customers, we have alpha and beta user programs, so people that are kind of our close advocates that we work closely with, and they get access to early features to provide user feedback. Last year we did a pretty major UI reskin, And we worked very closely with those customers. They had a lot of feedback on things, where the color contrast wasn't quite right, or the font size was too small, or certain buttons were difficult to click just because the hit area size was too small. All stuff that we had, identified during design and development, but that we validated again another time from customers of saying, hey, this thing is hard to use. And so we were able to listen to that to address those issues, and then get out a pretty successful launch last year. So exciting stuff. All right, number 6. Focus on prevention, not just remediation. I think this is where it's the easiest place to become burnt out as someone working in the accessibility field. If you are just focusing on the remediation part of things, which maybe some definitions here. Remediation would be fixing existing content or existing features. Prevention is more just making sure that new content is accessible and fixing those processes underlying. So it's very easy to get burnt out when you just focus on remediation of, okay, we've done an audit, we have a whole bunch of things wrong in our app, and so we went through and we fixed everything retroactively, and great, that took 6 months and we did all that. However, now we just released a new feature, and guess what? It's not accessible either, right? So now I have to go back and remediate that. That can be very frustrating, right? Of why do we keep building these inaccessible features? What we really need to do is be focusing on the prevention part, right? So let's not just fix these things in production after we already have released the features. Let's back up a little bit, right? In DevOps world, let's shift left, right? Most issues, most accessibility issues really can be caught in the design phase. Let's make sure that the proposed designs, from your designers or product managers, are going to be accessible. Let's make sure that we don't have, various patterns that are obvious anti-patterns that we shouldn't be following, right? If we can do that during the design and engineering handoff, it will be much easier to prevent those while it's still just in a design phase, as opposed to trying to fix them during or after the code phase. There you go, that's tip 6. All right, number 7, this is one of my favorite ones. Accessibility training is not a one-time thing. We need to focus on continuous education. Just about every company I've worked at has had mandated training programs, right? You've probably taken like a yearly security training, right? Where you had to go through this 1 or 2 hour course and check it off the box, great, and you've done your security training. Now you're a security expert and you remember everything and you implement it everywhere in your day-to-day work. It's not super effective. That doesn't happen, right? You don't become a security expert after one training if it's not something that you are directly focusing on every day. The same thing happens for accessibility. We put like some onboarding training or a one-time, once-a-year training, and then just expect everyone to be accessibility experts and to know how to apply it in their jobs. We retain very little information from any sort of training session, right? So that's not enough to do a one-year thing. Some things we've done in the past that have worked or haven't worked. At Adobe, we had an accessibility guild. These were monthly meetings. We would have they were just 1 hour meetings. We would go in very in-depth demos and presentations on, this is how we build accessible nested interactive content, or this is how we build accessible tooltips versus toggle tips, but going into very specific engineering features. Those were a lot of fun, and I have a lot of good demos and content and artifacts as a result of those. But I'm not sure they were super effective. We had pretty low attendance. A lot of effort went into those without a lot of, I think, ROI for doing those. People had a hard time, just finding an hour in your day. Everyone's busy. Could conflict with other meetings as well. So I don't know. Accessibility guilds went okay. Maybe it'll work better in your company. One thing that we do at Webflow, which is one of my favorite things, how I start out every morning, is we have an accessibility channel, and I go post an accessibility tip of the day. These are just simple, short, engaging things. We've now been doing this for over a year now. I think we're on tip 243. So I've worked 243 days in the last year. It's been wonderful. But it's been super fun. It's provided a good way to keep accessibility top of mind. It's very simple for someone to go read the tip. It takes 1 or 2 minutes, right? And it's not just this one-time training. It's also a good way to generate just engagement, good conversations, questions people might have about the specific content that we're covering. and also allows you to cover really a large breadth and depth of content. If you're interested in those, I do post those on LinkedIn as well. It's under the hashtag accessibility tip of the day. So go check that out if you'd like. All right, number 8. Remember that accessibility benefits everyone. When it comes to getting buy-in for accessibility, some of the common pushback you might hear is, yeah, but we don't have that many disabled users, or we don't have any disabled users. In responding to that, my first thought, is that false? That's incorrect. You probably do have disabled users. The World Health Organization, estimates that roughly 15% of the world population has some sort of disability. That's 1 in 6 people. That's a lot. So you likely do have disabled users, whether or not you know it or not. 2, even if that were true, if let's say it were true that you had no disabled users, there might be a reason why. Maybe it's because your product is inaccessible that you don't have disabled users, right? They're not going to be able to use something that they cannot use. Now, that being said, accessibility benefits everyone. It's not just those who have maybe a visible disability or identified as someone who is disabled. There's so much overlap between just accessibility and usability and design. So much of accessibility is really just doing things correctly, right? Like there's one of the benefits of HTML and CSS and JavaScript and just the front end stack is it's very easy to build things quickly. It's also very easy to build things poorly and to do things incorrectly, right? You can hack anything together that you want, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're following best practices. So again, it benefits everyone. I mean, for example, we can talk about color contrast. No one likes squinting to look at white text on a yellow background, right? Like, no one likes to do that. So let's have good color contrast. If there's bad contrast, it's hard to use, an app on your phone while you're outside in the sun and it's bright. It's hard to see. If you have better contrast, you can fix that. Same for keyboard accessibility. Many of us, I would venture to say, use a keyboard to navigate through form fields, right, as you're completing your checkout purchase online. We're not necessarily using the keyboard because we must. We could use our mouse or our trackpad to go click each individual input, but we don't want to. It's not very convenient. It's a lot easier to navigate with the keyboards faster. So even though you might not necessarily need that accessibility benefit, it still helps you. It's a better UX. Great. Let's see. My last little speaker note on that, just because, if you ever find yourself struggling to get people on board with accessibility, it can help to pitch it as more of a user experience or usability problem. Maybe you're not even saying the word accessibility, but just that, hey, I have some ideas to help create a better user experience for our users. You might find that designers may be a little more excited to work on that. Okay. Tip number 9, build your business case with data. Keep track of sales deals and customer feedback. One of the other difficult things when advocating for accessibility or trying to convince, maybe upper leadership or management to get on board with accessibility initiatives, is that's very difficult to measure the actual impact of those efforts, right? To measure that actual return on investment. People don't often say like, yes, I bought your product because it was accessible, or you won a sales deal primarily because it was accessible. It's usually a combination of both, right? I visited your e-commerce site and I was trying to buy this product I was interested in, and I was able to because it was accessible. Or we were evaluating your tool as a SaaS company, right? We evaluated you against a couple of other vendors, and you have all the features that we like, and it's accessible, and we meet certain maybe compliance regulations or guidelines that we need to. So it's hard to pinpoint just the one thing, but I think you can still build up your business case with that kind of anecdotal data of realizing that, like, hey, this was a factor that helped unblock that last sales deal, or this was a factor that applied in that scenario. Just keeping track of that again, just anecdotally at Webflow, we have an accessibility channel I mentioned. We have to get sales reps in there all the time just saying, hey, we have a prospective customer that's reaching out and they're evaluating us and they want to know how accessible we are. So we have an accessibility conformance report that we've created, and we can easily send that out to customers to say, hey, here's where we're at. This is our current report of conformance of all the good and bad things that we have going on. All right, let's move on. Tip number 10. Don't worry about the naysayers. Start with those who are excited about accessibility. This is another really common question of, again, okay, I'm on board, I've bought in, accessibility is important, I want to start some accessibility initiatives, but how do I convince other people that this is important? I know this is important, but how to convince my boss, my coworkers, my CTO? There's a lot of different answers we could give to that. We could appeal to people's feelings about morality, and this is the right thing to do, right? Is the moral thing to do, make an accessible app. We could talk about financial and legal reasons of think about this untapped market that we have if we made this more accessible. Again, going to legal reasons, we could avoid a potential accessibility lawsuit, right? We can try to speak their language, think about the things that they care about. A different answer, a different way to approach this that I really liked, is don't worry about them. Start with those who get it. I think you will likely find, if you look around, that there are other people who do already care about accessibility at your company. They're already on board. You don't need to convince them. So start with those. Start with those who get it. Find the accessibility allies that already exist, and go from there. Tip number 11, celebrate small wins, gain momentum, and watch the enthusiasm spread throughout the organization. Going along with that last tip, right, don't worry about the naysayers. If you are able to find those people who are already the accessibility allies at your company and are able to do something, get started, do something off the ground. You fix, whatever, the color contrast issues in your app, or you have one page that you couldn't use with the keyboard primer before, and now you can. Find something that you can do, and then celebrate it. Celebrate what you've accomplished, show people what you're building, show people the progress that you've made, and the enthusiasm will start to spread. Other people will join you as you go, as they realize the impact that you're actually making. One thing that we do on Webflow, again, with this accessibility channel, we use it for everything. We post accessibility wins of, hey, we found this really major bug that was affecting a lot of areas, and we fixed it, and look at all these beautiful benefits as a result of that. Or, hey, we had this customer, they had some accessibility concerns, we were able to talk to them, and due to the work that we did here in this area, we were able to close the deal, right? So we use that to share that, just those small little tidbits of information to show people, hey, things are happening, positive things are happening, and more will continue to follow. Tip number 12, this is the last one. Accessibility is never done. This is another thing that's important to set reasonable expectations, both for yourself and for others in the company, perhaps for leadership, is that some people will say, like, okay, we're gonna fund this accessibility project, and then we'll just be done. We'll be accessible, and everything will be great. That's often not how it works. You may have finished a specific project, right? A specific maybe remediation project or something. But what about the changes that happen next, right? Software is continually changing. Every single day, we're adding or modifying or removing code. It's never done. So make sure that those reasonable expectations are set, both for those managing just timelines and projects throughout your company, but also for yourself. I think accessibility professionals tend to get burned out, especially as they've been doing it for a long time. Realizing that, hey, we've accomplished a lot, but there's still so much to do. And unfortunately, that's just always going to be the case. That's the nature of the field. You're never going to finish. You will never arrive. So focus on what you've accomplished and be proud of that. This is the recap. I'm not going to reread all those, but if there's ever time to take a screenshot or take a photo of the slides, this is it right here. But there you go. Those are your 12 tips to help your accessibility efforts scale. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And lastly, just thank you for being an accessibility ally. Thanks.